questions you have about predictive analytics, AI, and machine learning, you can think of this as the free consulting segment of our webinar, Open Access to the Modeling Agency's Analytic Gurus. Senior consultants Scott Terry and Keith McCormick. Looking at my panel here, Scott is not back, but make sure to take advantage of this. It's the combined experience. Just by entering your questions into the panel, you'll receive specific compelling insights to help you on your way to gaining value out of predictive analytics. Be pleased to read them aloud for Keith or myself to respond. And with no questions, my panel is nothing but white space. Keith, before I go into any seed questions here, any summary, anything from your segment that you'd like to expand upon, or should we go into a seed and see if that opens up or motivates any other questions?
Yeah, I would say, obviously I would love to get an audience question, but even if the question is coming from you, or maybe a question that's been asked in the, we come across questions from time to time, that would be what's of greatest interest, I think.
Sure. Well, Randy just rescued us with a question. What are the three, oh, I love this. Thank you, Randy. What are the three most important soft skills of a data analyst? And, we've started to resist even using the term soft skills. It seems to be kind of a turnoff for many, but it seems to be a kind of a necessary task in serving as a translator. There's a great Harvard Business Review article that I'll include in the follow-up email that speaks to this and the importance of those soft skills. And I think Keith in his presentation underscored a lot of the soft skill type of socialization that you need to do within the organization in order for your analytics to find a home and ultimately be operationalized. So Keith, Randy asks, what are the three most important soft skills of a data analyst?
Well, I know what I want to put in first place for sure. In fact, I just got a question like this at a conference recently, Eric, but it came in a different form. It was a fairly new analyst, new to their position, kind of recently minted, but seemed like a very sharp guy. And he said, Keith, it sounds like the process that you're describing is that executives come to you with a problem that's clear in their own mind, or seems to be, but isn't really in a form that you can help them. In other words, it's been stated as a business problem or a pain point, but it hasn't yet been translated into a predictive analytics problem. He said, how do you, and I think he was partly speaking for himself, but he said, how do I then talk to that executive and deal with that discrepancy, but navigate what could be a potentially uncomfortable situation? And of course, obviously, the greater the age gap, or the greater the gap in the hierarchy within the organization, the more difficult that becomes. But one way or another, that has to be navigated. So that's the one that I'd put in the #1 slot.
Okay, and Randy's asking for three. I can...
well, the translator, I held back on purpose to a degree, because maybe you could describe the translator role as because of course that's on the back end, I believe, as the HBR article talks about it, right? You've got to get the results and then translate back into the language of the business, correct?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's on both ends. You've got to involve the leadership up front. Many times leadership isn't sure what they can ask of the data. So framing the question, sometimes they need a little more education or background, or demystify the practice and understand what different departments within the organization, what resources they have access to, and what can even be asked of the data, and what's involved in shifting the mindset to being data-driven. What's the impact of that? You may come up with a very productive model that many within the organization are uncomfortable letting go of the handlebars. And even if that's so, and the organization needs to become data-driven, what's a way in which we can step into that, having a model perform as perhaps an advisory system before it would take over control of some of the decisioning, certainly the operational decisioning that becomes mundane or redundant for domain experts to be freed up to be more dynamic. And that's one of the mindset issues I think that comes up a bit, is they're afraid of being marginalized by this data-driven system, and there's nothing further from the truth. They now become more valuable because they can be more creative in applying their experience, I think.
I
So,
think that, Eric, I think, I don't know if
yep.
I don't know if you intended to just now, but you just identified our third one. And of course, Randy, I wouldn't necessarily want to be constrained to the number 3. I might, easily come up with 5. But basically, even though these soft skills that we're talking about may seem like variations on the same theme, they're really not. So the first one would be translating the business problem into a problem that the modeling algorithms are capable of helping you answer. And there's an art to that, because again, what will happen is an executive will come to a data scientist or a predictive analytics expert with one project in mind. But very often what you have to do is gently, but still firmly push back and say, as defined, that project doesn't have legs. We have to work on this problem definition. Obviously, it's not going to work. And the thing is, there's a surprising amount of technical acumen that comes into play at that point, because you kind of have to straddle the two. It's very similar to being an architect. A young couple could come to an architect and they might have this really cool concept for a home, but it could be that there's something structural about their request that really makes it not entirely possible. So you have to kind of do that dance between the technical and the soft skills. So that's one. And then, Eric, again, you may not have been intending to itemize, but you mentioned a terribly important one, which is the end user, the person who's ultimately going to use or is going to be, in their mind, on the receiving end of this new machinery that's inserted into the business, where the scores are then generating decisions. Organizational resistance can be assumed. It will always occur. So what you do is you seek out the potential sources of it, and you have to involve them very early on. And this is delicate for a different reason, not for the same reason as the first one. The first one, potentially the data scientist is of a very different rank of the executive that they're serving, and that can cause a little bit of a problem. Now you've got an issue where the person who's going to be affected by this new mechanism that's being put into place might feel powerless in the situation, right? So now you've got this other power dynamic that's going on that can be very uncomfortable. You have to seek that person out. They could be the person who's in charge of maintenance down at the rail yard, or they could be a nurse who's now the way that the patients are going to be checked out of the hospital has changed, because if somebody has a high risk level, they're going to be kept in the hospital an extra night. You have to seek those people out who are on the front lines, because they could be affected by this. And then finally, that translation role is quite different, actually. Even though you might be dealing with the executives again, now you've got a different kind of a power dynamic. You've got the data scientist who might be seen as the member of a kind of technical priesthood, where they know all these fancy terms, but you're ultimately doing this to serve the needs of the executive. So if you don't translate that back effectively, so all 3 have the same thing in common. They're all about a power dynamic. The first one where the executive presumably is going to say this is how the project is going to go down, but you have to gently push back. Then you have the end user who feels like they're on the receiving end of a power dynamic. And then finally, if you're not careful, the technical jargon can kind of come off as a weapon, creating distance between you and the business. And of course, you don't want that at all. You want it to be applied. So you have to know how to translate effectively so that everybody feels like they're being heard and understood. Hope that didn't come off as too much of a rant, but it's an important question.
No, the way it was received here is probably some of the most important considerations around leading to analytic success that we can possibly impart from our experience. And I don't know that there's that much being said. I'm just starting to see the early trickles of the importance of the translator. And I think what the Harvard Business Review article was stating is that's what's going to be a vacuum of talent. There's certainly a good demand for data scientists at this point, but those who can not only serve as translator, but also analytic lead, which I think, in my view, is the person who would report to the CAO or the CTO, is the person that serves as that diplomat, and the role in between the data scientists and practitioners and leadership to pull all those dynamics together, including with any other components of the team, the BI and IT team, the subject matter experts, project manager. Well, they'll often be serving as project managers. That may not be a separate role. So somebody had asked me, is translator a potential future role? Well, I would like to see that be the role of the analytics lead, because they're going going to serve as a translator inherently, and they're going to coordinate all the different roles that come together. I think they're going to run by a comprehensive framework that's both strategic and tactical in nature. And I'll
Well, and
show
the coders, Eric, don't have the bandwidth, do they? Right. So just to revisit that, here's the problem. You know, every once in a while, people will make light of this kind of thing. The phrase that I saw on LinkedIn a couple of weeks ago that got my attention, it said, "Watch out for all this chicken soup for the soul" type advice around analytics, right? But people misunderstand, right? It's not just the soft skills. It's not just finding somebody that has the gift of gab. That's not what this is all about, right? Because sure, you need the soft skills, but you also need the technical chops. So somebody with the soft skills but doesn't have the technical chops is not going to be able to do this translator job. However, they don't necessarily have to get into the technical weeds the way a coder could. So I agree with you, Eric. That's why I think it's this kind of management tier that really needs it. And then finally, in addition to those two things, they need to really understand the process in the sense that they've been through this before. Because, in fact, I was just talking to a client, Eric, and they said, well, I went to the subject matter expert and I did what you coached me to do, Keith. But he made a very interesting comment. He said, but remember, I don't have as much experience as you, so I got a lot of value out of talking to the subject matter expert, but I know there are questions that you might have asked that I wouldn't have known to ask. And he's right. Unless you, and if this is your first rodeo, no matter how sophisticated you are technically, and no matter how skilled you are with soft skills in general, you won't know the exact steps or the exact questions to ask. So it's technical chops, soft skills, and experience working together. And if you don't have that experience yourself, you have to borrow it from somebody.
Well, and I think that relates to the one part of the Harvard Business Review article that I did not agree with, and it was their summary section, or right before the summary, which was that the translator or the analytic lead needs to be a domain expert. And I would argue that, and I'll be curious to know your perspective on this, Keith. I think it's almost dangerous for the analytic lead to be a true domain expert because you can introduce bias in how the data is going to be accumulated, how it's going to be transformed. You can breathe some bias into what should otherwise be an objective model. And I think that the domain experts need to be involved at the tails of the process, but there needs to be cautions as to having them bleed in some of their biases into the process.
Okay, I understand the point that you're making. Now, what's going to happen, of course, is if that person is in that analytics management role for 3 to 5 years or more, and let's face it, we don't want to hire someone for a position like that for 10 months, you know. So if they're in that position for 3 to 5 years, they're going to develop some domain expertise. However, it has been frequently said, and I don't disagree with it, that when you're looking for an analytics team manager, hiring from outside has some value. What I usually discourage folks from doing, and I think you've overheard me talk about this, Eric, is that the modeling lead, the person who's going to actually physically be building the model, you know, the one that's really kind of focused on the technical aspect, it can be extremely helpful in many ways for that person to be hired from within, not hired from without, because it makes them, you still always have that interaction between the model builder and the subject matter expert, but you don't want there to be so much of a reliance there that the subject matter expert runs into bandwidth trouble. But sometimes with a new analytics team, let's say you're a chemical company, bringing in an analytics manager who's a banker, or vice versa, a chemical engineer coming in to run a team in a bank, people are afraid to do that, and they shouldn't be. They shouldn't be, because that person in that translator role adds value if they come from a different industry, as long as obviously they're not a curmudgeon and they're don't have the lines of communication open. There can be tremendous value to being that open-minded, investigative mind coming at things from the outside.
Right, absolutely. That's, yeah, and that was part of my argument, and we seem to be aligned there as well. And Randy, Randy said, wonderful answer. Thank you. Thank you as well for the question, Randy. Truly grateful for that. We are 2 minutes over the hour. I'm going to pull up you're still with us, Randy, and I hope we're not running you too far over, as well as a few others. I'll pull up this slide just as a final punchline here. When it comes to those soft skills, I think they're more involved in the right side of this diagram here. You can see where there's a trend in value to the organization, the orange line that increases as you move from left to right. So much of what you find online today, great training around coding and accumulating the data, math and statistics, value starts coming up when we move into machine learning, predictive AI, deep learning. Of course, when you start getting into the real world application, that raises up as long as you're already doing things the right way and not reinforcing some bad habits. But then when we get into strategic process and serving as an analytic diplomat and understanding the dynamics of the organizational implementation, how to pull all the different parts and people together and socialize it and coordinate it and ultimately lead that whole process, I believe, and this is a chart I put together to illustrate TMA's uniqueness with its training and some of the philosophy, at least that I impart, that this is what's the right side of this, that I think a lot of organizations are leaving immense value on the table because there is a lot of fascination, it seems, on the AI and the coding. Keith, I'll give you a last word here before I go into wrap up, but I did want to give that quick illustration as one final visualization of what we've been talking about here.
Well, I think it ties in with what we were talked about earlier. I don't think I have anything to add at this point.
Sure. Okay. Well, at 34 minutes past the hour, we'd better draw this event to a close. Certainly like to thank our attendees today for your sustained interest, your active participation, as well as Scott and Keith for your great presentation segments, and Keith for the very informative Q&A contributions, and certainly to you, Randy, for a fantastic question that we were able to run down the road with. We'll follow up with an email shortly with some resources and suggestions that will hopefully be useful to you, including a link to the Analytics Clinic. Do make a point to join us for the March 15th episode, where the topic is designing analytics projects for insight versus action. Keith will be your expert clinician and serve on the panel as well. From there, we hope that you'll consider joining us at a public classroom or live online training event soon. Make sure to go to the website and check out the schedule and details for the upcoming productions, starting with San Jose, California on April 23rd, and the live online experiential platform on June 18th. On behalf of Scott, Keith, and myself, thank you again for attending Predictive Analytics Failure to Launch. Have a very pleasant afternoon and evening, and this brings the webinar broadcast to a close.